Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the first lecture of the year for the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology. My name is Matthew Brown. I'm the director of the center, and I'm very excited to tell you about our new lecture series that we're starting tonight, all organized around the topic of the heart of medicine. We're looking at ethical issues and values issues in medicine from the side of research, from the side of medical practice, patient care, to the imaginative and conceptual sides of medicine. I won't read all the names and abstracts and so forth, but if you pick up our program, you'll see the rest of the speakers for the year. Our next speaker in February will be Greg Bear, the science fiction author. I'd like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank Dean Dennis Kratz, who is the founder of the center and a great supporter of everything we do. I'd like to thank Magda Groman, the associate director of the center. Without her, none of this would be possible. I'd like to thank Lisa Morgan, who is off doing some important task, breaking down or setting up something for us. Our development officer for the School of Arts and Humanities, who's very helpful. I'd like to thank everybody in our advisory councils who help us determine our themes for the year and give input on various ways in which the center develops its programming. So I'm going to introduce to you our speaker for tonight, James Robert Brown from the University of Toronto, a philosopher of science and philosopher of mathematics, who's done amazing work on thought experiments in science, on the issues that occurred in the science wars, and as you'll see tonight, on issues in medical research. Jim doesn't know this, but he actually plays an important role in the development of the Center for Values in some important sense, because in 2006 at the Philosophy of Science Association, he gave a lecture a talk entitled Politics, Method, and Medical Research, which I attended, and it was the first philosophical discussion of the relationship of science and values, in philosophy of science to values in politics, that really captured my attention and set me on the path to being where I am today and running the center, and surely has had an impact on the way we do things here.
Golly, now I feel terribly responsible.
So everything that we do wrong is Jim's fault. All right, well, so without further ado, James Robert Brown, the crisis in current medical research.
Thank you all very, very much, and thank you, Matt, for the introduction and for the invitation. I must say it's a real pleasure to be here. I've traveled through Dallas once or twice before, but I've never actually been here. I do go to Houston often because my wife is from Houston, so I actually feel some kind of connection, loose connection, I admit, but some sort of connection to Texas. What I'm going to talk about is some stuff in current medical research, largely pharmaceutical stuff. And these issues, or issues related to medicine in general, are popping up all over the place. You can't possibly avoid them if you read newspapers. And while I was preparing this talk, there was a couple of front page, well, I don't know, actually I'm not sure they were front page, but they were prominent articles. One was just yesterday in the New York Times, biotech firms, billions at risk, lobby states to limit generics. And it went on about how the lobbyists who sink endless amounts of money into this, as you probably know, they rival the NRA for lobbying influence in Washington and everywhere else. And anyway, they're trying to have some sort of effect on essentially keeping patents alive, and huge billions, often billions of dollars flowing into their coffers. Another one, which I came across just, oh sorry, that was yesterday. This was a few days ago. This headline said, antibiotic-resistant diseases pose apocalyptic threat. That's from Dame Sally Davies, who's the chief medical officer in Britain, and she's worried about antibiotic use and the problems we are about to hit. Now, these are sort of very current headlines. This is one that I bet a lot of you don't know, though you should know. This was a few years ago, 2008, it was revealed that Prozac is useless. And it was done in the form of just looking at the clinical trials that had in fact been done. And a British researcher started to poke into this and got a whole lot of unpublished clinical trials. And when the data was all put together, Prozac and other drugs that are of the so-called SSRI class, they in fact tie a placebo. I thought, oh, well, there goes Prozac, the day I saw that headline. But it turns out that it's just not well known. And Prozac and others continue to be prescribed and so on. A bit of a mystery, wouldn't you say? Now, of course, you have been deeply involved in Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, for the past several years, and it was a major item in your election, so I'm sure it must be deeply into your consciousness by now. You might think, well, this is about healthcare delivery and this is about healthcare research, so maybe they shouldn't be run together, and maybe they shouldn't. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the connection at the very end, so this will come back up again. So here's our problem in a nutshell. How is it that we can ensure high-quality medicine in the light of all of these potentially corrupting factors, these conflicts of interest, and this corporate research funding problem? And this is a problem in three important respects. It's obviously a problem in medicine. That goes without saying. It's a problem in ethics and public policy, simply because it affects us all and we want to know what we should do about it. Now, for those of you who might be philosophers in the audience, I'm going to say something that you might not find intuitive at all, but I'm going to persist in this. This is a problem in epistemology. It's a huge problem in epistemology. It's very unusual. Usually we talk about simple kinds of cases where how evidence, bears on some theory. But the general problem of epistemology is really how should we organize everything such that we maximize the evidence available and use it in the most effective way for evaluating rival theories. And that may involve a big dose of politics. That's unusual when you're talking about epistemology, but it's there, and I'm going to dwell on it. Okay, so here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about antibiotics. I'm going to talk about corrupting influences. I'm going to talk about clinical trials, how research aims are skewed by commercialization, and the failure of attempts to deal with this with regulations. Now, I'm going to do something unusual. Usually when I give talks along this line, I just bludgeon people with examples and lull you into tranquility. You feel overwhelmed with these examples. And then I spring my solution on you, and sometimes people don't know, oh, wait, where the hell did that come from? And now I'm going to tell you the solution in advance. Okay? I'm going to argue for socialized medicine, and that you should socialize medical research. It should be taken completely out of the hands of corporate hands and put entirely into the hands of the University of Texas at Dallas, for instance, with your local friendly biochemists, et cetera, working on things like NIH grants, no corporate funding at all, the end of partnerships, the whole shebang. Okay? Now, I want to warn you that this is where we're going, okay? So you can get your guard up. I don't want to cheat you and give you these examples and you think, oh yeah, oh this is terrible. What are we going to do? And then I spring it on you at the end, and you're going to think, damn, I was suckered. I want you to be defensive. This is, after all, America. I'm a foreigner. Okay, this is America. This is where everybody's supposed to be a capitalist, and. So I expect enthusiastic criticism at the end of this, real hostility. And I want to see, I'm expecting a good performance here on your part. And you're supposed to tear into these examples and say, no, no, they don't work the way you think they work, okay? All right, that's where we're headed. Now, first, antibiotics. Look, they're just nowhere near as good today as they were 50, 60 years ago. The heyday of antibiotics was in the 1950s, just after the war. And the problem is evolution, Darwin. And you can't pray it away. You're stuck with it. This is one place where you'd like to say, damn Darwin. If only it were wrong, but it's not. And these damn little bugs are evolving, they're adjusting, they're becoming resistant. They are adapting to their environment, and their environment includes these antibiotics, and they're becoming resistant to it. We're down now for a disease like gonorrhea, is treatable by one and only one antibiotic now, and it'll soon be untreatable. And pretty soon, gonorrhea, which used to be a serious problem and has become a non-problem, is going to become a problem again. We're not that far away. I mean, if I need a hip replacement in, well, I hope not all that soon, but if I need one way down the road, I could just die of an ordinary infection, and it won't be treatable by antibiotics. There just won't be stuff available. Now, what's the problem? Is marketing making this worse? Okay? Now, if you take, let's sing the praises of capitalism for a moment. Even Karl Marx thought the world of capitalism. Of course, he hated it, but he thought it was the most incredible and impressive revolutionary force the world had ever seen. Because, as capitalists pat themselves on the back for being incredibly innovative. And Marx certainly thought that. And he thought that they could get stuff to market very fast and so on. So, I mean, if we're talking about antibiotics, look at this. Dreaming up new antibiotics, bringing them to market very quickly, selling as much as possible, finding all kinds of uses for them, not just for treating infections, but non-therapeutic uses like putting it in animal feeds, low levels of antibiotics in animal feeds. Okay? The trouble is each of these uses contributes enormously to the overuse of antibiotics and to their eventual uselessness. And this is the situation we're facing in the very near future. It could be quite a catastrophe. Now, there's a consensus on this, by the way. Even the industry who make antibiotics, who develop them, invent new ones, discover new ones, develop them, put them on the market, even they say this is a market failure. The ordinary principles of free enterprise are not good in this case. They in fact have exactly the opposite effect of what would be the ideal situation. It's universally agreed we have a problem here. We should unquestionably sell less, we should use less. When we develop new antibiotics, they should not be put on the market. They should just be hoarded, saved, not used until the last possible moment. Okay? And we shouldn't really be using them in animal feed. Otherwise, and if we continue doing this, violating these sorts of principles, we're going to end up with what the chief British medical officer stated was the apocalyptic threat. It will hit us. Okay? So, question. If free enterprise can't solve this problem, then who should step in and solve it? Actually, that's a rhetorical question. I'm not going to answer it yet, but you know what I'm going to say, right? Okay. Now, let me shift gears here slightly and talk about bias and corruption. There have been a lot of studies, really interesting studies, looking at patterns of published articles in various medical journals. And then, well, once you have a whole lot of studies of those, then you have these meta-studies. Actually, they're meta-studies, studies of articles, and looking for general patterns and so on. One of the very nice ones was by Beckelman about a decade ago, who claimed that financial relations among industry, scientific investigators, and academic institutions are widespread. Conflicts of interest arising from these ties can influence biomedical research in important ways. That's putting it mildly, very carefully and mildly. Okay? Another study done at roughly the same time by Joel Lection found very similar things, studied different cases and so on, but came to essentially the same conclusion. In fact, if you pool the Beckelman results and the Lection results, what you get is consequences like this. The articles reporting trial outcomes of a new medical product, like a pharmaceutical, some sort of drug, it is 4 times more likely to be favorable to the sponsor of the trial than if done by an independent source. Okay? Now, 4 is, that's horrible. Let me give you some particular ones where it's even worse. So one of the early serious investigations into funding outcomes in clinical trials was done by Davidson. And what Davidson looked at was 107 papers that were published in, I guess that they were all on the topic of internal medicine. I'm not absolutely sure about this. But anyway, some collection of 107 papers on a particular range of topics, and compared rival drugs dealing with a related set of problems, and found that the drug produced by the sponsor of the research was superior, according to the article, was superior in every single case. This is truly remarkable. This is like a guy who wants to play some game with you about, well, let's flip coins, and you know, heads I win, tails you lose, and he wins. He gets heads 107 times in a row. Now, it might be a fair coin, but you begin to suspect not, right? Here's Stelfox on calcium channel antagonists. Found that authors, 96% of the authors of favorable articles had financial ties to the manufacturer of the calcium channel blocker. But when the article was unfavorable, only 37% of the authors had financial ties. Actually, I'm amazed that it was above 0. In another study, Friedberg on oncology, cancer drugs, 5% of published reports on new drugs that were sponsored by the developing company gave unfavorable assessments, whereas 38% of published reports were unfavorable when done by an independent source. So you can see that what's passing for evidence in medicine is just horrible. It's second rate. It's third rate. It's terrible. Now, for a lot of stuff in life, who cares? In fact, for a lot of stuff in life, we don't really care because we know ourselves. So if Apple says, well, we've done some tests and we claim that the quality of music in the iPhone is fabulous. Well, we've got all these research reports to show. Well, so what if they claim that? You can go out and buy an iPhone and listen to it and decide whether or not it's good or not. Okay? But when you're talking about something like blood pressure medicine or statins or cancer drugs and so on, you have no idea whether you're the unlucky 1 in 10 who is going to die with this drug because it cures 90%, or whether the drug is absolutely useless and had no effect at all. Okay, now there's been a lot of famous particular cases where the drug has been, there's a lot of behind-the-scenes corruption. Vioxx is a very famous example. This is the brand name for a so-called COX-2 inhibitor. Merck is the company that put them out. And it was marketed as a pain reliever, especially for arthritis. And your FDA approved it in 1999, and about 80 million people were using it, and annual sales were about $2.5 billion for a while there. This is the so-called blockbuster drug. Okay, so 5 years later, Merck took it off the market because of heart attacks. There were a lot of heart attacks with it. Now there was, okay, so you can sometimes, you can learn things in, in so-called later phases, trials. After a product has been done, you get these phase 4 trials where you're supposed to keep track of things and find out if anything's going wrong, and then maybe withdraw your product if it is. So maybe they learned something later. But there was this study was put out called the VIGOR study for the Vioxx Gastrointestinal Outcomes Research. And it was published in 2000. And what it did was compare Vioxx with another rival drug. And they found that, yes, indeed, Vioxx actually led to a 4-fold increase in heart attacks. But otherwise, they said, oh, Vioxx is great. Yeah, there's more heart attacks, but we have an explanation for this. And the explanation is that Vioxx isn't causing heart attacks. Rather, it's the rival drug actually had some kind of protective mechanism, like aspirin, which might reduce the number of heart attacks. So it's not that Vioxx is causing them, it's rather that the rival is preventing some that would happen naturally. Now, there's a hell of a lot of physicians who said that was a load of crap. But nevertheless, it had no effect, their claims, and the FDA did, in fact, approve it. Later, it was revealed, and this is just outright dishonest, okay? It was revealed that they had held back a lot of information. And so the New England Journal of Medicine, which was slightly embarrassed over the whole business, they wrote that, waving their finger at Merck, said, more than 4 months before the article was published, the VIGOR study, at least 2 of its authors were aware of critical data on an array of adverse cardiovascular events, heart attacks, that were not included in the VIGOR article. They're just suppressing information. Lancet, the British journal, was outraged and said the damn drug should have been pulled in the year 2000, not 2004. And there's a lot of lawsuits, as you can imagine. Okay. So anyway, we've got all of these cases. So what are we to do about it? What kind of response can we make? What can we do? Well, could we require better quality testing? Could we enforce conflict of interest rules? Could we require some kind of tighter regulations, but otherwise leave the industry intact? Or could we do something else? Again, rhetorical question. I'll leave it for you to tentatively fill in your own mind what you might do. All right. Now, medicine, pharmaceutical research is rather special. It's not unique, but it is rather special. It's quite different than a whole lot of things in science where the evidence is sort of open, it's public, anyone can check it. You might need a lot of training in order to appreciate the evidence. It might take you a little while to sort of work through it and so on. But what I have in mind typically is that he's claiming a theorem, okay? He's claiming a theorem, and he's published a proof of it in a math journal. And she doubts it. She just doesn't believe him. She thinks, I know that guy. I'm sure he cheats on his taxes. I don't believe his theorem either, she says. But she can work through. She can read through the journal and say, damn, he got it right. He's actually got a proof of his theorem. This is what I mean about being publicly accessible to the rest of us. Now, she may have had to crack the books and take 6 months working up the subject before she was able to read the article. But there's a lot of people in the world who can read it and tell us what it says. And for most science, it's like that. But there's a lot of science that's just not. It's just it's practically inaccessible. We can replicate it, but not practically, not really. And this is what we get, and I'm going to call this sort of stuff one-shot science. And this is a real problem with pharmaceutical research because of the general requirement, which may be, in fact, too strict, but the general requirement of randomized clinical trials. The reigning ideology for a lot of medical research is what's called evidence-based medicine. And I know when you look at that, you say, what? They're demanding evidence for medicine? What did we demand before? Okay? Oh, it's just a hunch. No, what it really means is that according to the claims of people in so-called evidence-based medicine, they say, look, there's a hierarchy of quality of evidence. At the very top are randomized clinical trials, and at the very bottom is your physician's clinical experience. Okay? And in between are various kinds of studies, retrospective studies that's based on past data and stuff like that. And this hierarchy is important. And a physician with a great deal of experience can often tell you something interesting about what's wrong with a patient or whether a drug works and so on. But it's the worst, it's the least reliable form of evidence that we have in medicine. Now, in some ways, this movement for evidence-based medicine is a real advance. There's no question. However, it may in fact be too strict. There are other techniques that we can use, good, reliable statistical techniques that are nowhere near as expensive as randomized clinical trials. The drug companies tell us that randomized clinical trials cost on average about $800 million. This is a few years ago, the claim. They're probably claiming it's over $1 billion now. $1 billion, imagine that, $1 billion to test a drug and bring it to market. Now, they're lying when they say that. When they tell you how they calculate the $1 billion, they're including all of the money they spend on advertising for the drug, okay, which is a lot more than what we would normally say the research is. Okay? Research is much less component. But a reasonable figure is in the neighborhood of, let's say, 150, maybe even 200 million. It's still not something that we can go out and do. So if she's got a drug company and she says, I've got a great drug for reducing everybody's blood pressure, and I say, well, how do you know? She says, well, I did this clinical trial. Here are the results. But I just have to take it on faith that she's done this. I cannot, unlike her, to check the math proof, I cannot do that because I don't have a spare $200 million to replicate the study. And what's especially bad in this case, if the government were, say, to get in the business of double-checking pharmaceutical results, the thing is the first one to produce the result and publish it gets the royalties. So your government would be doing all this incredibly expensive checking, and it would be coming out of your pocket, and you'd still be paying monster royalties to the drug companies. Okay, so let me talk, wait, did I get everything there? Yes, okay. So let me talk about this sort of in general terms. So there's low cost evaluation for some things and a high cost for others. And for instance, it doesn't cost you much to check if you've got mice in your house. You just sort of look around, and it probably doesn't cost you anything. Maybe it takes half an hour to look around in some places to see for the traces of mice. On the other hand, if you want to find out if there's life on Pluto, that's going to cost you a bundle, isn't it? You're going to have to send a rocket to Pluto and land one of those little things that pokes around in the ground and does chemical analyses to see if there's any microbial goings on there and so on. That's going to really cost you. On the other hand, also low cost is checking a math theorem. Okay? Now, there's a very narrow criterion of evidence here. It's the proof. It's got to be a good proof. Nothing else matters, just a good proof. In the case of checking for mice, well, there's all kinds of ways you could check for mice. You could just see one, or you could have indirect evidence. Okay? But in the math case, you've got to check the theorem. If John has a broken leg, it's pretty narrow evidence for checking for John. Just screaming and hollering won't do it. You want an X-ray or maybe the bones sticking out or something like that. Okay? But it's low cost. On the other hand, when you've got narrow criterion for evidence, like a proof, but you want to prove something like, say, the four-color theorem. You remember, everybody remember the four-color theorem? Four-color theorem says if you've got a map, it only takes 4 colors to prove it. It's a famous 19th century problem, proved in the 1970s, but only with the use of a state-of-the-art computer at the time. It took several hundred hours of what was then called an IBM 360, which when you said it, it was like magic, you know. Ooh, an IBM 360. Okay? That was like HAL. Remember HAL? Okay? All right. So that took, you actually with your home PC, you can prove it pretty quickly on your PC now. But the thing is, it's a kind of proof by cases, and there are thousands of cases. You're not going to work through it, you know, with paper and pencil. Check everything to see that it works. You've got to trust the computer. And a randomized clinical trial is like that. Incredibly high cost form of evaluation and very narrow criterion of evidence. So in the evidence-based medicine hierarchy, you've got to do this. If you want to believe something, you've got to run a randomized clinical trial. Very narrow criterion of evidence, but unbelievably expensive. Okay. So, thousands of hours of computer time in the one case, hundreds of millions of dollars for the randomized clinical trial in the other case. So even though in principle you can do it again, from every practical point of view, this is one shot. You've really only got one shot at it. Now, how do we know that we're on the right track? How do you know that the proof of the four-color theorem is a good proof? You can't work through the proof. It prints out as tens of thousands of pages. You can't work your way through that. Well, you could work your way through that, but the chances are you can remember along and don't make a mistake while you're reading it is just too high. Forget it. The way you check the proof of the four-color theorem is to actually look at the computer program that generated the proof. You don't look at the proof, you look at the program that generated it. And you look at it and say, yeah, oh yeah, I see how it works. Yeah, if it's like this, it'll take these cases here, and that'll cover 50,000 cases like that, right. And these other 50,000 that are like that, right, I see how it would get those. And if it works through the whole thing, it will settle it. Okay? That's how you agree on a computer proof that something actually is working. Okay? Now, what about in a clinical trial? Again, we don't look at the clinical trial in detail. What we're going to do to be sure that the clinical trial works is to look at its design. How was it designed? How did they randomize? How did they get the people into the two groups? Who were the study group? Who were the placebo group? Okay, stuff like that. You look at the structure of it, and you look at how it's being executed, and you've got to trust the people who are executing it, right? So if you're going to trust a randomized clinical trial, the results of it, you really have to control it. You can't leave it in somebody else's hands. Now, in the case of the computer proof, I'm not worried about mathematicians. They're not going to make any money off this, right? A little fame and fortune. But it's not, they're not going to get rich. Okay? I don't think the guys who discovered the four-color theorem, I doubt that they made any money. Do you know if they made any money? I doubt it. Highly unlikely. Okay. Anyway, the thing is, we, that's us. We must check the design and execution of the randomized clinical trial. Okay? We have to control it. And so, first, I've been asking rhetorical questions so far, but now here comes the first major claim. All randomized clinical trials, all clinical trials, testing drugs, should be carried out by a publicly funded, neutral agency, such as state-supported universities. No private funds. Okay? Now, that's the first thing you should balk at. All right? I mean, if you, well, okay. All right, but I'm far from finished. Now, this is going to help improve the quality of clinical trials. Okay? I mean, it's still hard to design good ones, and we might be misled by them. They might be improperly designed and so on. But at least we don't have commercial interests corrupting them. Okay? So it should help improve the quality of clinical trials. But there are other aspects of medical research that we still have to worry about, and I'm going to be coming to those later. Now, the way most people want to deal with these problems, like the antibiotic problem or the problem of possible corruption of medical trials, the way people want to deal with them is through some kind of regulation. Okay? So they admit you can't just leave it unregulated. Only an idiot would leave it unregulated. We'll all die if we leave it unregulated. So it has to be regulated, and we just need the right set of regulations, and we need to enforce them and all of that. So is this even the right approach? Okay. So now I'm going to talk about journal rules and the journal response to these problems. Now, the journals are the gatekeepers for much of what for medical research. They're the ones that publish these results. They're the ones that, because of the articles, the various articles that appear in there, your family doctor will sometimes read these and decide to treat you one way rather than another way based on what he or she is reading in JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine and so on. Okay? So, the journals have a lot of rules. Rules about authorship. Now, this is a real interesting problem. A great many articles that appear in journals are actually not written by researchers. They're written by ghostwriters. So the data, it will be gathered by a corporation. The writers for the corporation will then write the first draft of an article. And then, because you're in partnership, and you're in partnership, and you're in partnership, and you had 3 patients, and you give me your data, and you had 7 patients, and you give me your data, and you had 5, and so on. And I'm the corporation now. I'm collecting this data from all of these people. You're having no input on the ultimate result of all of this. And it'll be written by a ghostwriter. Now, the journals are getting really upset about that because they realize that the ghostwriters are interpreting the data and setting the rhetorical tone. Now, you can say, well, when they're fiddling with the data, we know it's cheating. But we know also that even in a very dry as dust scientific article, you can write with a tone. And if you have an ear for English or whatever language you're reading, you can tell when a certain kind of enthusiasm is coming through or not, just with the choice of words and the language that is adopted. And so these ghostwriters can be really important. Now, the journals are really annoyed about all of this. And while they're not forbidding ghostwriters, they want it known who's doing the writing. And they also want it known what was your part in the ultimate analysis of the data, and what was your part, and so on. And these are relatively new rules, awfully hard to enforce, but they're having some slight impact. Previously, you'd have input, you'd give me your data, you give me your data, and so on, but you'd have no input. I produce the article. You get your name on it. Okay? So you're padding your CV, it's getting bigger, your research record's looking good at your home university, but you had absolutely no say in how your data is being used. Now you must be involved according to the journals. But of course you can just waive it and say, what the hell, I don't care. This is really important too, an obligation to register trials. So you can't get a trial published now unless you register the trial somewhere publicly prior to carrying it out. This is hugely important because even though you're not obliged to publish any trial, and if it's bad results, you might just want to hush it up. But the thing is, we know that you did it. And we might say, look, you're trying to tell us something about this drug here, but we know you carried out a result on something similar. Show us that earlier data. They can't deny it anymore. Now we know. Okay, they've registered. Okay, that's important. And new conflict of interest rules, very scrupulous conflict of interest rules that are trying to head off all of the nasty things that people can do. So everyone, all participants in the peer review publication process must disclose all relationships that could be viewed as presenting a potential conflict of interest. Incredible range of things, and you wouldn't believe how complicated it can get. Of course, the obvious ones are you are paid as a consultant, or you go to an information session, which, well, for a Canadian, go to Hawaii in February to an information session on Tuesday morning. Bring your family for the whole week. Okay? Oh my, that's attractive. And of course, you can be part owner in something and all of that too. Okay. Now, here's Catherine DeAngelis, who's a wonderful person in all of this. I disagree a lot with some of the things that she has to say, but she's really a force for good. She's the longtime editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is probably with the New England Journal, it's the most important general journal of medicine. And she's making a lot of claims and really worries about what's going on. She thinks there's a hell of a lot of corruption, and she's trying desperately to fight it. She's recently resigned, so she's no longer the editor, but she only resigned about a year ago or so, something like that. Okay, anyway, she thinks that discovery and testing of new drugs and treatments is mainly by for-profit companies. We'll see. We'll see if that's actually true. And she thinks this is a good thing, but, and then she has a few caveats here. Talking to her in private, these come across a hell of a lot stronger than here, but she's worrying about marketing. She's worrying about hiding the full data. She's worrying about harmful effects that are being suppressed. She's also worrying that many companies won't allow their authors to submit articles to JAMA anymore, because JAMA have their own stable of statisticians, which is new. They said, we'll look at this data. We don't want to we're not trusting you anymore. And the companies say, to hell with you. We'll publish somewhere where they take our word for it, not your word. You're not double checking our arithmetic. Okay. Now, she admits that this is a terrible problem, especially conflict of interest. She can't enforce it. And that's because JAMA has several thousand multi-authored articles a year. They can't possibly check into the financial background of all of these people. You just have to take it on faith. And she even says that if she tried to do something within the law, she'd get hit with antitrust suits. I'm skeptical about that, but it's possible. I don't know. It's amazing the range of things that people can do that are conflict of interest, and you can't even anticipate. There was one fellow who would regularly write reviews of new products, and those reviews tended to be negative. And the declaration at the end would be, I have no financial connection with this company at all. I don't own any shares, et cetera, et cetera. And it was all true. He had no financial connection. Turned out he was part owner in a little Wall Street company that specialized in selling short. All they did was look for a company that they thought their stock was going to go down a couple of points, and they'd sell before the stock went down. And he knew how to drive a stock down. You can't anticipate that. You just you stumble across it. That's all you can do. Okay, so here are some DeAngelis' claims. So she thinks, first of all, properly regulated for-profit medicine is a good thing. Now, this is a real voice of authority. So this is one of the leading voices of a sensible, strongly regulated regime of medical research. Okay? All right, so for-profit medical research has been beneficial, she says. There are more new products and treatments coming from private than from public funding. That's the claim. And it's amazing how widespread this view is. Almost everyone I talk to thinks that this is true. It's not true at all. Now, this is a truly remarkable result. This is your own FDA, which has its own very serious problems. But they used to keep a little tally on their own of their own private evaluation of the drugs that they were licensing. So they're mandated to do the following. If they've got a new drug and it seems to be effective, which only means it beats a placebo. That's all it takes to be effective. It doesn't have to beat the best alternative around. It just has to beat a placebo. If it does that and it's not obviously harmful, then they have to license it. Okay? Now they keep track of these things. And so over a period of 5 years, they licensed 415 drugs. And here's how they classified them. They said 14% were new innovations, good stuff. Only 14% was good stuff. But another 9% were, in fact, old drugs that they'd already licensed, but there was a significant improvement in them. Okay? So we're now up to about a quarter. 3/4 aren't. 3/4 they thought were more or less worthless. And those 3/4, 77%, are mainly what are called Me Too drugs. So these are copies of another drug. So Eli Lilly produces Prozac and make billions. So on comes Zoloft, you know, to pick up their share of the market and so on. If SSRIs worked in the case of Prozac, they probably work in the case of Zoloft. It's not really something new. It's just, you know. But the FDA has to approve it. There's slight variations in it, enough to get a patent. But really, medically, it's not really a very significant change. Now, if you take the particular year, 2002, 78 drugs were approved, and only 7 were classified up here in this group. 7 in the new innovation or significant improvement. And not one was by a US company. Not one. Where's the good stuff coming from? It's coming from your tax dollars, your NIH-funded studies. That's where the innovations are coming from. They're coming from universities, not from Eli Lilly, not from Novartis, not from Merck. That's a stunning thing. Do you know, FDA is not allowed to keep their running assessment. They were prohibited during the Bush administration. The lobbyists said, well, they bugged the Bush administration and said, you can't let them do this to us. And so the FDA was forbidden from actually keeping this kind of record, their own assessment of what was good, what was worthwhile, and what wasn't. So you can't get that anymore. Unless Obama allowed it back in, I don't know. I suspect not. Okay, that's hugely important. Okay? Keep that in mind when you're thinking about who does the good stuff. Where is it really coming from? Okay? It's a myth that the good stuff is actually coming from Lilly and Merck and Novartis and so on. All right, next claim. She admits that financial interests can and do corrupt. No argument. Now, there's something really, really important that she omits. And in fact, everyone who is a regulator trying to regulate the corporations here, it's missed by them all, but it's hugely important. And that is that what happens with private funding is that it skews research in a certain way. The only kind of research private corporations are interested in is something that will result in intellectual property at the end. If it doesn't have patents coming with it, they don't care. They're not going to fund anything that is independent from patents. So what it means is when they join into some kind of partnership with university researchers, they'll say, yeah, we're delighted to work with you on this cancer drug. But broccoli, you think broccoli is, no, let's not work on that. We can't patent broccoli. Let's work on this drug that we can actually license and make money from. So what it means is that there's a huge range of things that just get completely ignored, like exercise, the effects of exercise, diet, the environment, what the effects of the environment upon us, and perhaps other drugs that can't be patented. Exercise is really interesting. There's very little work done on exercise. Everyone knows that exercise is sort of important. But the only test I know of with exercise and depression exercise actually had a better effect on depression than Prozac. This is Prozac as a placebo, because now we know that doesn't work at all. It's just a placebo. But exercise is better. It beats a placebo. Okay. Now that's not great. That means it's about 25–30% of people who are in the mid-range of depression with an appropriate regime of exercise can actually come out of it. I mean, it's certainly not a cure. But for a lot of people, that would be pretty good. Okay? So I think a hell of a lot more work on exercise would be really worthwhile. But of course, as you know, you can't patent that. It'll soon leak out. Papers will say, here's what you should do, and you've got it. All right? Nobody's going to collect a penny from you. Now, private funding also skews research towards chronic treatments against vaccines. Who the hell wants a vaccine for AIDS when you can sell this cocktail of drugs to someone with HIV for the rest of their lives? It's always towards more profitable problems. High blood pressure. We have high blood pressure. We don't get malaria. We have money. People with malaria tend to be poor. They can't afford anything. So this will always be through foundations. Bill Gates, for instance, will promote this. Okay, not to make a profit, but to solve the problem itself. It also has skewing medical research towards non-problems. I don't know if any of you know about Serafam. Some of you might know of Serafam. So as the Prozac patent was getting close to ending, the Eli Lilly announced to the world a new medical condition. It's like premenstrual syndrome, but this is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And they have a solution for you. It's called Serafam. It is chemically exactly the same as Prozac. There's one change. Prozac is green. You can guess. You can guess what color Serafam is. Who wants to guess? Actually, it's not quite that. It's very close. It's lavender. I knew you were going to say pink. It's actually lavender. Okay, so anyway, this is the skewing of research directions that might be, this sort of skewing might be even worse than the corruption and the falsification of clinical data. This is a really serious problem, but it's hard to measure. The final of DeAngelis' 3 claims was the one about how hard it is to disclose conflict of interest because she just can't really get a grip on the problem. She can only do it partially. Okay, so that's it. The regulation mindset, okay, for people in general who have this mindset, oh, by the way, it includes all of these people. This is the International Committee of Editors of Medical Journals. And those are the big mainstream journals like JAMA, New England Journal, Lancet, the Canadian Medical Journal, and a whole lot of journals like that. It's about a dozen of those, the really big general journals. They've all adopted this as a common policy. And a lot of other journals follow suit. But these rules are always at least a step behind the problem. They don't seem to have any effect. They can't keep up. I find them largely useless. I actually don't know what value there is in disclosure anyway. I mean, if you've got corrupt data and the guy says, yeah, I'm making $1 million, being associated with this company. So what? So now it says so at the bottom of the article. But once television advertising takes over, I mean, it just wipes it all out. I mean, people still are prescribed Prozac in spite of the clear evidence. Okay. So the big problem, though, that we of seeking only patentable solutions. This is the big problem that remains. So is there an alternative to solving our problems? And here's a quick summary of it. The market failure, These are our problems. Market failure, like in the case of antibiotics, corrupting influences on clinical trials, pseudo-health problems like that Serapham case I just gave you, and mainly skewed research toward patentable solutions away from alternatives like diet, exercise, and so on. Okay. So now here it comes. Eliminate, here's my proposal, eliminate intellectual property rights in medical research. No more patents, no more intellectual property rights. All medical research, including clinical trials, have got to be publicly controlled and publicly funded. We pay. We're going to pay regardless, aren't we? We're either going to pay up front or we're going to pay through royalties. And the quality of this medicine is going to be a hell of a lot better if we pay up front. And then we get to control it. Okay? So I think if you accept those proposals, what would happen is that it would stop outright corruption due to financial conflicts of interest. I mean, we still have scientists, you know, with big egos and fudging their results, hoping to win a Nobel Prize and so on. I mean, we're not going to solve that problem. But we are going to solve the problem about corruption due to money. It would also allow us to make much better choices, rational choices on the direction of research. So we would sink money into exercise, broccoli, the effects of broccoli. Stop subsidizing corn in America. So one of the worst subsidies you have. Subsidize broccoli. Okay, I'm all in favor of subsidizing farmers, but subsidize broccoli, and the health of Americans would improve enormously. Okay, we'd also have a better vaccine and antibiotic policy. Now, here comes a hard part. And this is the part where I say something, it depends hugely on the audience. And so let me tell you. See, if I'm in Canada or in Europe, the next step is really easy for me. I say, look, you should start thinking of medical research as a natural extension of the health policy, of the health system. In Canada, we have socialized medicine, as in Britain and France and Germany and so on. And everybody loves it. And so I say, look, I know you're all in favor of free enterprise in everything in life, but not in medicine. You say, yeah, right. See, now look at all these problems. Yeah, okay, I see the problems. Now, wouldn't it just be natural to put that over in medicine where you already like socialized medicine? You just put medical research as part of the bigger system of medicine. And it's a very easy sell. People see the natural, you know, it fits together in a very natural way. But here it's different, isn't it? Now, I don't know what's in your minds in connection with this. You may be very sympathetic to this. You may be very hostile to it. You may have a view of medicine where medicine is simply another component in the American economy. There's cars, there's electronics, there's agriculture, there's medicine, there's Hollywood movies. It's just making money in different ways. If you have that attitude, then you probably aren't going to be very sympathetic with much of what I said. But if you think of maybe healthcare as maybe different, sort of like education, at least early education, that shouldn't be in private hands. That should be run by a good, wise, generous state. Should have really good schools and stuff like that. And if you sort of think, well, maybe medicine should be a bit like that, then maybe you can see how this proposal would fit almost seamlessly in with that. Now, that's not what you have now. So it's going to seem like a huge jump. And so huge that it might just seem wildly impractical. On the other hand, who knows what's going to come out of your Affordable Health Care Act, so-called Obamacare, in the future. I know people are going to tinker with it. It's not fixed. It's not written in stone now. There's a lot of stuff. There's obvious problems. And you're all going to know how to do it, how to modify it. And when that begins to happen, or if maybe a magic day should come and some politician just says, okay, we need a healthcare system, and I have a very simple solution. For seniors, it's called Medicare, right? Medicare for everyone, period. Goes on a bumper sticker. It seems to me an easy thing to sell in an election. And then, once you have Medicare for everyone, now start thinking of medical research as just part of the Medicare system. See how it would fit very naturally together? And it's a hell of a lot cheaper than letting the drug companies do it. You get much better medicine, you have control over it, and a hell of a lot cheaper. Our drugs are a lot cheaper than your drugs. It all happened. By the way, your medicine wasn't free enterprise medicine until just roughly 30 years ago. It's not obvious to you. But it was 30 years ago that there was a radical change. There were hardly any patents in medical research before 1980. The famous examples are things like the Salk vaccine for polio. And Salk was asked, well, aren't you going to patent this? You'll be a very rich man. He said, what? What? Patent the sun? Who could do that? Okay, it was just so manifestly obvious to him that it was inappropriate. He was paid a good salary by his university. His research was supported. And he had discovered something that was absolutely wonderful. And he was happy to share it. That was reward enough. And all of your medical funding was either by the NIH or by those charitable funds, you know, like the Kidney Foundation or the Heart Foundation, you know, stuff like that. That's where your research came from. And then in 1980, thanks to an act called the it's BAW, right? Bayh-Dole, the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. And the motivation behind this act was, pre-Bayh-Dole, any government money, the results of any government money had to go into the public domain. You can't patent. That was routine. And then the claim was, well, we, Americans, are not bringing all of our spectacular innovations and inventions in the universities, we're not bringing them to market fast enough. And the Japanese are racing ahead of us. So we need to do something. And what they did was, from now on, American taxpayer money in the NIH and so on would now go into partnerships, and you could now patent using government money. And this was supposed to stimulate innovation and improve the American economy. Well, it made a hell of a lot of, it made several pharmaceutical companies incredibly rich, but it's not clear that you got better medicine out of it at all. Anyway, that was the turning point. So I could say, well, look, if you don't like socialized medicine, you could just roll back the clock to 1980, you know? That would be a huge improvement. Okay, now I'm finished. This is my last slide. And this is for the philosophers in the audience. I don't know how many there are. You may be looking at this and thinking, well, what's this got to do with philosophy? This is, even if you're completely convinced of everything I said, you might say, yeah, but this is sort of science policy and stuff like that. It doesn't sound like epistemology. But actually it is. And I do want to stress this point. Now, there's a lot of high-level epistemology or scientific method that's probably eternal, unchanging, and that's the kind of thing that philosophers pay most of their attention to. But there's also sort of stuff that's going on at the mid-level where norms change, methods change, thanks to discoveries. And the paradigm example of this is just something like the discovery of placebo effects. So when placebo effects when it was recognized how influential they are, and that recognition came around 60, 70 years ago. People knew of placebo long before that, but that it would have this tremendous effect. That became important around 1950-ish. So then came the realization that testing actually had to change. You can no longer, I can't just invent a pill and say, here, it'll make your headache feel better. Does it? And you know, he's all these expectations and he wants to be nice to me and he says, yeah, I feel so much better. And then I write it up in a journal article and say, you know, Jim's pills work wonders and stuff like that. And that's just a terrible method of doing research. So, so we have to have clinical trials. So you go from the realization, from the discovery of placebos to the realization that you need randomized clinical trials, you need blind testing and so on. And so you adopt these as a kind of new methodological norm, all right? Discover a fact, new norm. New fact, new norm. All right? And so I want to say that the same is going on here. We've discovered a lot of stuff about the effects of commercialization on medical research. And that has led to the need for some new kind of reorganization of how medical research is carried out in order to improve the quality of the medicine itself. To improve the quality of the research, we have to do it in a very different way. The commercialization of research has been very bad news for medical research, and this would be a big improvement. But I expect you to be hostile, and I want to hear good arguments against it. Thank you very much.
Margaret's going to come around with a microphone, and so if you have a question, raise your hand, and she'll bring you the microphone so that we can get you for the recording.
You know, as a physician who has been around since the 50s and 60s, it's been very interesting to see what's happened. The standard that I was raised in was that the idea of, as you say, medical discovery should be part of the public domain. Being around when the polio vaccine and the vaccines for meningitis and all these measles, mumps, rubella, nobody made a nickel out of those, so it saved millions and millions of lives. And one of my professors when I was an intern said, remember, figures don't lie, but liars figure. And this is kind of what's happened in the fact of the egregious work and the need for money. If you've ever been to the Research Triangle in North Carolina and see the size and scope and beauty of the pharmaceutical companies that are based there, it's just absolutely remarkable. Question, though, is that the Mercks and the Pfizers and the Novartises have a presence in Canada as well. How do they regulate the Prozacs in Canada vis-a-vis what happens in the United States?
We don't. Unfortunately, we don't. There are two reasons. When it comes to licensing, we almost always just follow the FDA. If the FDA's licensed it, then the Canadian regulatory agency will look at the reasons and probably just say, okay, we're convinced, and license it in Canada. That's how all of those products come to Canada. There are a few exceptions. There are some drugs that are allowed in the US that the Canadians have thought, no, they're not safe enough, we're not convinced. The other thing, which is more a financial answer to your question, is that since this has become such big business for the United States, and as you can imagine, the United States largely controls the World Trade Organization. So little countries have to obey the rules imposed by the big countries, or else we'll be penalized very harshly. So we could thumb our nose at the patents, but then we'd be screwed on everything else that we try to export to the United States. So the WTO, as you all know, or anyone who's a member of the WTO, there are rules for trade and mechanisms for solving trade disputes and so on. There's a class of regulations that are part of the WTO general agreement, but it's sort of as an appendix. It's called TRIPS, and that's trade-related intellectual property, something like that. And that controls drugs. And there, the law has been laid down. And you will pay royalties to Eli Lilly and to Merck and so on. Now, there's a couple of other countries like Britain and Switzerland who are doing well in the pharmaceutical business exporting. So they actually tend to support this. Others of us, like Canada, we go along with it on the grounds that, well, we need to do it elsewhere. But at the time, we went along with it because this was about more than 20 years ago, and I remember when it happened, we had a conservative government in power, which was slightly unusual. And the Prime Minister at the time, Brian Mulroney, loved Reagan. This was when Reagan was in power. And tried to emulate Reagan-type policies. And so under pressure from Reagan, he was happy to buckle under pressure from Reagan because he saw the world similarly. So we had very restrictive patents. So even if we thought a drug was good, you wouldn't get the kind of patent protection and you wouldn't get the kind of royalties that you do in the US. He made a trade. And I remember how he sold it to the Canadian public. He said, well, we're going to join, we're going to liberalize our patents and go along with the Americans. And in return, we will have at least $250 million of research invested in Canada every year. And people went, ooh. And the next year they watched $5 billion in royalties leave the country in exchange for this $250 million in research. So it was a very, very bad deal. But most people don't know it. And the government doesn't raise it. They're not going to fight it because they know that they can't win if they want to stay inside the WTO. The only way a victory could be had is if there were a major rebellion of several countries who just said, we're not going to pay patents, we're not going to pay royalties on medicine anymore. They just cut it off. And if there were enough countries willing to do that, it might be successful. But it's hard to say how important it is. I've tried to find figures. Every time I find an economist who knows something about trade, I try to ask about how much in international trade is in the form of intellectual property, royalties. And no one knows, and no one can figure it out. So there are estimates for the United States, for instance, that you make in royalties and exports somewhere between 30 and 50% of the value of your exports is in the form of intellectual property rights. That's not just drugs. That's Hollywood movies, music, book royalties, anything for which there's royalties. And the reason it's hard is because if you export something, we'll just pick up an iPhone. How much is the plastic and how much is royalties? So when you pay for your iPhone, and that, I don't know, what do you pay, $400 or something like that, say, for a new one? You're paying royalties to dozens and dozens of people. Somebody gets 50 cents for this wire and somebody gets 7 cents for that transistor, and it's very hard to figure it all out. So they're only estimates. But if it's anywhere near right, a third to a half, you can see why no government is going to rest easy in giving up, maybe no American government is going to would easily give up patents on almost any product, and why a lot of countries would be seriously worried about them. That's a convoluted answer to your question. I'm sorry it was so convoluted.
I want to comment that there's too many hidden secrets. One of the hidden secrets is that the various different names given to public corporations are really just shell corporations that are backed by hidden money. And in the shell corporations, the boards of directors, you can't fit it together because the boards of directors are puppets for hidden money, which is somewhere else, which is all tied up in the whole mix of the drug corporations, if I'm making any sense. The other hidden secret problem is that when patents are filed and written, and the patents filed in the patent office in Washington, D.C., there are things that get left out of the cookbook ingredients, and you get into the argument of what's an active ingredient and what's an inactive ingredient, and the result is that the generic people cannot take the filed patent at the patent office and reproduce the same medicine because of the active and inactive and inadequate cookbook description at the patent office.
I think I dare say you're right about both of those. In the case of your first point, while there may be lots of hidden companies or hidden money behind companies, and the ones that I'm worried about, I don't think that is a problem. I'm talking about the companies I have in mind are things like Merck and Eli Lilly, and it's pretty straightforward who they are, who their salespeople are, who their employees are, and who their lobbyists are, and so on. So it's not hidden. It's pretty, yeah. In the second case, I think there are other problems with patents that are independent of the problems that I'm interested in. So patents are probably, I mean, remember the aim of patents. I mean, sometimes when people talk about patents, they say, oh, well, if you put all this work into it, you have a right to this. That's not true. You don't have a right to that at all. Nobody who seriously thinks about this thinks you have a right to it. It's not a moral issue. The patent legislation is always a carrot out there as a stimulus for invention. And we will give you 10 years or whatever if you come up with something clever. Not that we think you have a right to it, it's just we're prudent. We think that'll be an appropriate stimulus. Now, the thing is, what's appropriate might be, you know, for drugs might be 10, 15 years, something like that. But they've been given 20 years, and then there's all kinds of tricks that come up. So you can get ridiculous, bogus extensions. So if you've got a drug that's for, obviously for, you know, for heart disease, let's say. So it's only going to affect older people. But all you have to do when you're near the end of patent life is to say, you want to investigate the possibility that this drug will be good for kids, which is ludicrous. That automatically gives you another 2 or 2.5 year extension on your patent, just for asking, you know, because people want new drugs for kids. So it's a stupid law that was, you know, thoughtlessly put in. There was no constraints on it at all. And if you can find some new use for it, you can sometimes get an extension, and it's just bogus. And of course, the worst example isn't a drug example. It's Mickey Mouse, you know. Have you ever noticed? Every now and then you'll read in the paper, the patent, Disney's patent on Mickey Mouse has been extended yet again. Mickey Mouse will never go into the public domain. He will stay in Walt Disney's hands forever until Walt Disney is thawed out. You don't get that joke, I'm sorry. Some of you, some of you might be old enough to get that joke. Okay. Anyway, but that could, well, one of the first things that I showed you was the lobbyists asking for more extension on certain kinds of drugs, the so-called biosimilars, against the generic makers. That was, and Virginia voted in favor of it by 90 to 10 or something like that. It was, yeah. And the article said that the drug companies had given the Virginia legislatures $22,000. At first I thought it was each. Then I find out, no, it's a whole bunch of them. I thought, my God, are politicians so cheap these days? You can buy the whole Virginia legislation for a mere $22,000.
You mentioned that everything in this country is kind of based on patents and the profit motive, and that's why people aren't doing research on exercise and broccoli and things that don't pay that much. Is there anywhere in the world where they are doing that kind of research and maybe sharing it with us? Every now and then there'll be little bits done, you know, in various places in the world, yeah. But the biggest research establishment is right here. So nobody's really doing research on the things that aren't happening anywhere?
Yeah, there's some. I shouldn't. I gave the wrong impression if I said it was like 100%. That's wrong. When I went looking, I admit I didn't go looking all that hard for exercise, the influence of exercise on depression. But when I did look, I only found one article, and its results I thought were really interesting because the results matched Prozac as a as a treatment of depression. I didn't look elsewhere, but I'll bet there are more. And they're probably, you know, all over the world where there's some sort of medical research. Yeah.
So I understand that patents or getting rid of patents might be a solution, but that doesn't necessarily mean it might be the right solution, just like there's more than one way to prove a theorem. I know a lot of pharmaceutical companies may invest a lot of money in advertising, but a patient can't go and prescribe himself Prozac. Doctors are the ones who prescribe Prozac. So wouldn't it make more sense to intervene at the doctor's perspective in getting them to be more educated on how they prescribe their medicines? And considering that American journals are the gatekeepers of medicine, there's still a big problem in publication bias within these journals. Like, they're not willing, there were studies done showing that they're less willing to publish replication studies of ineffective trials and things along those ends.
Let me take up your first point, which is really interesting and important, the one about educating doctors. That's not an easy thing to do. So how would you educate? Huh?
Getting rid of patents is easy.
Let's put it this way. How are doctors currently educated? Medical schools, of course. But once they're out and practicing, let us suppose that a conscientious physician reads the journals. Maybe not cover to cover, but you know, we'll at least spot check. And so that's a good way to become educated. But if the journals are publishing corrupted material, how is a doctor supposed to find out what's better material? There's many ways of in fact, influencing doctors. One way is to produce, and this is a way of corrupting journals, and they're sort of almost witting partners in corruption. So if a journal is a little hard-pressed for money, one of the ways it can make money is by selling off-prints. So it says, yeah, we publish your article. Would you like off-prints? And Eli Lilly, whose work is looking good in this article, says, yes, we'll take 1 million off-prints. Whoa! This is you know, music to the ears of a journal, a hard-pressed journal, because they're now going to sell these. Now, Eli Lilly will then distribute them freely to doctors. Now, this is a form of educating doctors. Another form of educating doctors is to run a special issue of a journal. And this will be an issue that's really set up, edited by, and paid for by a drug company. But it looks like a regular issue. Now, you know, sometimes when you read ordinary newspapers, there's an article that's really an advertisement, but it sort of looks like an article. And there might be tiny, tiny type over in the corner. It says, paid for by, or, you know, this is a commercial, or something like that. But they fool you. You think you're getting regular news, but in fact you're getting a commercial. Well, that's what you're getting with these special issues of journals. So they will select the contents, and they'll be very favorable generally to the company. It looks like a regular issue of the journal. They'll go and distribute it to the relevant people, the relevant physicians, and this is another way of educating them. Now, for many doctors, well, I wish they were more critical, but you know, I suppose they work hard. They want to skim through and say, oh, wow, look at this. This is a study that shows that the kind of blood pressure medicine for that condition that I've been giving doesn't work as well as this other one. Maybe I'll switch. So that's a way of, you know, the doctor thinks he or she is doing better by the patient, easily influenced, a little uncritical perhaps, persuaded by a horrible institution of free samples. Free samples are a very bad thing. If your doctor offers you a free sample, tell him or her how wicked this is. It's a trap. You take the free sample, you say, yeah, it seemed to be okay, and now it'll be prescribed from now on to you. So these are the kinds of things. So who's going to educate them if they're not educated this way? Well, we could have government agents educating them. And you can imagine the uproar when the government is going around and telling doctors, here's the real truth. Now, if the government objectively thinks this is the real truth, Why the hell are we putting up with these corrupt practices anyway? That's what we should do. I bet you've got more anecdotes than I have about how you were, quote unquote, educated by the corporations. Do you have any really nice, juicy stories?
Well, yeah, they're just limitless, the number of stories. One. A very, very good example was a young lady who was an assistant professor at Stanford who was doing a seminal study on thyroid disease and was backed by the pharmaceutical company, who had a caveat in her contract that said if they didn't like the results, she wouldn't be allowed to publish it. And she worked for 2.5 years. Had she been able to publish it, she would have gone from assistant professor to associate professor with tenure. And the pharmaceutical company said, since you said that this drug did not work any better than what we've had, we're not going to let you publish it. This created a huge brouhaha, as you can imagine, and it was finally published, and she was able to get tenure. This was at one of the top medical schools in the country.
Yeah.
And this is what happens, that, you know, figures don't lie, but liars figure. Now, Kathy DeAngelis, an old friend of mine, she was one of the outstanding pediatricians on the faculty at Johns Hopkins. And she probably quadrupled her income when she became the editor of JAMA. And some of the things that she said, she never would have said 10 years earlier as a professor at Johns Hopkins. There's a caveat to everything. And these are things that go on and on and on. You know, the drug companies, when they hire a drug representative or salesman, they go to the big universities, hire the prettiest girls on the cheerleading squad.
Yes, yes. Repeat. You've got to repeat this.
Yeah,
let me.
They're cute and they're bubbly, and they go, and every male physician they call on falls in love, and they will use whatever she's peddling, and she'll bring lunch, and she'll bring lunch as well. So, you know,
this is truly. Let me just repeat that to make sure this is absolutely reinforced. The salespeople, the preferred salesperson for any drug company, you would think they'd say, well, you know, we'd like to hire you as a salesperson. Did you do biochemistry, perhaps, as a degree? She says, no, but I was a cheerleader. See, wonderful. That's exactly who we're looking for. This is the #1 employee as a drug company salesperson. So this is pretty, when it comes back to educating physicians, this is actually pretty damn discouraging, isn't it?
This love fest against corporations is fine, but
oh, good,
the love fest for government bothers me. Let me just posit a counterfactual with government. Let me suggest that the four bad abuses of research in the 20th century have been, let's start with Lyshenko in the Soviet Union, the AIDS epidemic in South Africa when the National Party took over and said, no, this isn't true, it's something else, killed millions. In our own country, you could say George Bush and stem cells, whereas if it's all national stuff, you can shut it down overnight. And I'd say the last one would be Nazi Germany, where it's state-sponsored research funded by the medical establishment. It scares me. Now, we're Canada, we're Britain, everything's nice, but the state seems to, even down here, I don't know if you read about our scandal with the state government and sponsoring cancer research through state agencies. Oh, it's just fascinating. But it's political, it's not just corporate, it's the political people. Now, why should we expect an impartial state-sponsored research wing to do well? I mean, I'd say the 20th century, the lesson is just the opposite of that. And I'd even go back as far as to Newton when the Church of England says, if you're going to continue with your university appointment, you've got to swear allegiance and believe in the Trinity. And Newton says, no, I'm committed to science first.
No, he said yes.
He didn't swear allegiance to the Trinity. No, he lost his position.
He was not a Trinitarian, that's for sure. But I think he
had to swear allegiance in the 1690s to the Trinity. But I'm just saying it's not a benign institution, the state. So I'm just sort of raising it. You said you wanted grenades. There's a grenade, which is,
yes.
Why should we trust the state?
Well, I imagine it to be set up in a certain way so that the medical establishment is at arm's length from the state. So it's not as if the politicians can get in and meddle.
Here the politicians work.
No?
Yeah, it's a little hill.
Oh, sorry, that's only in setting it up. taking it out of private hands and setting it up. And then it's at arm's length. Now, I mean, I know that politicians will meddle, but you have your, I presume you don't want to wipe out your NIH, let's say. So you think that it's probably a good idea that you have an institution like the National Institute of Health that will fund medical research. Now, that is supposed to be, ideally, it's set up as an arm's length institution funded through taxes to it, but politicians can't go in and meddle with policy. They decide on what to fund and what not to fund. So just imagine an NIH that's just a hell of a lot bigger, but still that kind of arm's length. Now, that's what I want. Now, I know as a matter of fact, you'll get politicians getting in and meddling. And sometimes they'll even meddle like George Bush and say a certain line of research is just verboten. But I think, well, it's still, I mean, it is, I admit, it's conditional on a half-decent government. I guess that's a background assumption to it all.
Just follow this one thing. What controls the NIH if they, what controls the NIH if they put out data that's just lying or wrong? And of course, it would be independent labs that can say the NIH is wrong. I mean, that's the control. That's the whole principle of the check on government lies in independent organizations other than those sponsored by the state that can tell the state, you're lying to us.
Oh, well, actually, I'm not worried about that because you've got tons of independent groups who could catch the NIH out in a big lie, namely your various universities. I mean, if you're a biologist working here and the NIH is trying to tell us something crazy, you call the local newspaper and say there are fruitcakes over there, and here's why. And you've got lots of independent people like that. Then, I mean, if you had a truly terrible situation arising in the NIH, then maybe the government just has to say, okay, for a while we're not going to be at arm's length. We're going to launch a serious investigation. It's going to make recommendations. It's going to overhaul you. We just don't trust you. We'll get you back on the rails, and then you're independent again. I don't deny things like this can happen, and I certainly I hope I'm not naive about this. I mean, we're still dealing with human beings with their egos and different ways of being corrupt, and some people are still going to want to get ahead professionally, and they'll fudge their evidence and so on. But I think the big thing that's going on, the commercialization influences, at least we'll pull the rug out from under that. That's my hope.